So here is the first of two of these consecutive number problems that we'll do together. There's a couple of them. This one is question 7. It's just talking about three consecutive natural numbers. And then we'll also do question 10 where we're talking about three consecutive odd numbers. So that we get a little variety here. But this first one here, question 7, the sum of three consecutive natural numbers is 135. What is the biggest of the three numbers? You see a lot of questions like this. It's a common type that shows up. And if I'm looking for three consecutive natural numbers, any of these problems where they're talking about finding numbers that are missing, the good news is usually your let statement is nice and straightforward. It's going to be something like let n be, in this case I would say the first consecutive number. Sometimes it'll be the first consecutive even number, first consecutive odd number, or first multiple of 5, or first multiple of 7, or whatever it is. And so coming up with a let statement, usually pretty straightforward. Now, the step that I keep saying is the hardest step here is step 2, coming up with the other expressions in your problem here. In this one, if you're saying, what are the other things I don't know about? Well, I don't know the first number, but I also don't know what the second and the third one are. And just in case you don't know what consecutive means, I know we bring it up in class, people might be shy about putting up their hand saying, oh, I don't actually know what consecutive means. It just means one after the other, right? Like if you're saying, like, what are four consecutive numbers, any four consecutive numbers, that could be something like 6, 7, 8, 9, right? They're just one after the other. Or -2, -1, 0, and 1. In this case, we're talking about natural numbers, which means no negatives, but you get the idea. So if you're stuck at step 2, one of the techniques that I really recommend you use over and over is say to yourself, if I can't come up with the algebra for this just yet, then let me try dealing with numbers, because numbers I'm more comfortable with. So in the example I just gave of four consecutive numbers, I said 6, 7, 8, and 9. Say to yourself, well, if I look at the 6 as that first number, what am I doing to that to get my second consecutive number? Like my expression here, I'm looking for the second consecutive number is equal to what? Say to yourself, well, if I go from 6 to 7, what's happening? I'm not doubling it, right? Some people, their first reflex would be if n is your first consecutive number, your second one would be 2n. But if I were saying 2n, I'd be saying 2 times n, which would mean instead of getting 7 when I go from 6, I'd get 12, right? 2n, if n is 6, would be 12. So instead, what's happening? Well, I'm just adding 1. So if I would add 1 to the number, then let me do the same thing when I'm dealing with algebra, right? I'm not really worried about 6 right now. I'm worried about n. So if going from 6 to 7 means adding 1, then going from n, the first consecutive number, to the second consecutive number also means just adding 1. So my expression here for the second consecutive number is n plus 1. I also want to know what expression I'd use for the third consecutive natural number, right? That would be this plus another one, right? N plus 1 plus 1, which would get me to 8, right? If I'm saying what happens in going from 7 to 8, it's 7 plus another one, so n plus 1 plus 1. Or you could just write that as n plus 2, right? You'd say if 6 is n, then getting from 6 to 8 means n plus 2. So my third consecutive number is n plus 2. And now I've got all the expressions I need here. The question, notice it's asking what is the biggest of the three numbers. It's going to end up being the third one. Oh, watch out for when you have questions like this. We'll come back to it in a bit. But the next step, and really after step 2, probably one of the more challenging ones, writing the equation here. I have to write an equation where I have two things that are the same as each other. And if I'm stuck, I can also say to myself, is there information in the problem I haven't used yet? This 135, notice we're not using it anywhere in what we already have. So we can build our equation with that 135. You might have extra information that doesn't end up getting used for anything. But in this case, my 135 works pretty well. So I know that 135 is the sum of the three consecutive numbers. That means I'm going to write all three numbers added together. N plus the second consecutive number is n plus 1. And the third consecutive number is n plus 2. And I add all three of these guys together, and that's what gives me my equation. I make it equal to 135. once I've got that taken care of, now I've just got to solve the equation like this. I say, okay, let me first get my brackets out of the way, because I just say, well, there's like a little invisible positive 1 that I'm using to distribute, right? Plus positive 1, distribute that. So I have n plus 1 plus n plus 2 equals 135. And now that the brackets are out of the way, I can add like terms together, right? N plus n gives me 3n. 1 plus 2 gives me 3. So I've got 3n plus 3 equals 135. And now that I've got it simplified as much as possible, that was my priority. If I would check and see, are there any n's on the other side, right? In your equation, you want to always get all your letters together here. But there aren't, so I just want to isolate n now. What's stopping it from being isolated? There's this plus 3 here. There's this 3 in front. So I'm going to get rid of this plus 3 here first. I'm going to take away 3 from both sides of the equation. And I end up with just 3n on this side and 132 on the other, right? 135 minus 3 gives me 132. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 3 to get rid of the 3 in front of the n. And I end up with n is equal to 132 divided by 3, which is, I don't know, 44? Is that right? I think that's right. So if n is 44, at this point I've done all my algebra. I think I've got a good answer. But I want to make sure and check it. If 44 is good, then that means that's my first consecutive number. The second one would be 45. The third one would be 46. I add those three together and see if they get 135. 44 plus 45 plus 46. Hooray, that actually does give me 135. So my answer's right. Now that I've checked and verified that I've got the right answer, I'm going to write a sentence that answers the question. The question is, what is the biggest of the three numbers? So my answer would be, the biggest of the three numbers is 46. And that's my problem solved. Okay, let's do another one. This one, a little bit different. We're talking about three consecutive odd numbers. Odd numbers, right? You can think of some examples of odd numbers like 27, 29, 31, right? Or 41, 43, 45. In this case here, you'll see it ends up affecting how our step 2 works. The beginning is still the same. You're still looking for your first consecutive number, except in this case, since we're talking about consecutive odd numbers, I'm going to change my let statement a little bit and add in that I want the first consecutive odd number. And then once that's done, depending on how sophisticated you're being here, you can get involved in some number theory and start representing, instead of using n for your first consecutive odd number, you could call it 2n plus 1. But that depends on you recognizing a little something about the set theory, knowing that n must be an element of naturals or an element of integers, depending on what the question says. We're not really doing that this year, so just leaving it as n or x is fine for now. In later years, you understand you have to be a little more specific. Here I've got that n's my first consecutive odd number. At this point, remember, when you get to step 2, you've always got to say to yourself, if these were actual numbers, then, this is inopportune auto update, thank you. All right, say to yourself, if I had real numbers, what would be happening here, right? I'm going to make up 3 consecutive odd numbers, like 31, 33, 35. And I say to myself, if this is my n, my first consecutive odd number, what am I doing to it to get to the other guys? And to get from 31 to 33, I'm just adding 2. So I'm going to write my second consecutive odd number is n plus 2. Because all I'm doing to get from 31 to 33 is I'm adding 2. All that I'm doing to get from 31 to 35, I'm sure you're ahead of me on this, is I'm just adding 4. And that gives me my third consecutive odd number. All right, I got all my expressions. My n plus 2, my n plus 4. The question is asking me, what are these three numbers And it tells me, this last piece of information I haven't used yet, that the sum of them is 75. That means I can use that to make my equation. If the sum of these guys is 75, then I'm going to put an equal sign for step 3. It's about writing the equation. I'm going to write an equal sign. On one side, I'm going to put the sum of the 3 numbers, which is 75. And over here, I'm also going to put the sum of the 3 numbers. How do I write the sum of the 3 numbers? I just have them all adding up together. N plus 2 plus n, oops, kept small n plus 4 equals 75. And again, if this equation's messed up, if those expressions are messed up, I'm going to catch it when I verify at the end, right? If I accidentally did 2n instead of n plus 2 or something like that, then I'll spot that when I get to the end. So if I have this equation, step 4 is always solving your equation. So your first step would be to get rid of the brackets by imagining like there's a little +1 here that's making these brackets go away. And now I've got a nice cleaner version without any brackets. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify by putting my like terms together. I've got n, that's 3n, and then I've got 2 plus 4, that's 6, is all equal to 75. 3n plus 6 equals 75. Now I'm trying to isolate n. I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides, which will get me to just plain old 3n on this side and 69 on the other side. So 3n equals 69. Divide both sides by 3. And you'll be left with just n over here, which is what you want. And 63 divided by n gives you 23. I want to check, do I have the right numbers here? If 23 is my first consecutive odd number, that means that n plus 2. My second one will be 25. My third one will be 27. 23, 25, 27. If I add those 3 together, 23 plus 25 is 48. Plus 27 gives me 75. That matches the information here. I've verified. I'm happy. I've got the right numbers. So now, step 5. I look at what the question's actually asking. What are these 3 numbers? And I answer that question in a sentence. The 3 numbers are 23, 25, and 27. And that is how you solve that one.